The summer of 1665 was the hottest anyone could remember. The Thames shrank between its banks, exposing mudflats that baked in the sun. In the narrow streets of St Giles in the Fields, just outside London's ancient walls, a woman named Margaret Pontius fell ill. She developed a fever. Then came the headache, sharp, splitting. Within hours, a soft swelling appeared in her armpit. Her husband called for a searcher of the dead. An elderly woman paid pennies by the parish to examine bodies. The searcher pressed the bubo with her thumb, felt its heat, and knew. Margaret Pontius died on April 12th. The parish clerk wrote plague in his ledger. That single word changed everything, because once the plague entered a house in 17th century London, that house became a tomb. The authorities nailed the door shut from the outside, painted a red cross above the frame, and added the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Margaret's husband and children were locked inside with her corpse for 40 days. A watchman stood guard outside to ensure no one escaped. This was the law. This was how London fought the plague. By September, 7,000 people were dying every week. To understand what London lost, you must first see what it was. The London of 1665 was not the industrial behemoth of later centuries, but it was already the heart of England's maritime empire. Nearly 500,000 people crowded into a space the Romans would have recognised, a walled city barely 2 miles across, surrounded by sprawling suburbs called the Liberties. The riverfront was chaos. Thames Street ran along the water, lined with warehouses stacked with pitch, tar, brandy and oil. The wharves reeked of fish and tar and rotting seaweed. Ships arrived daily from Hamburg, Amsterdam and the Levant, their holds filled with spices, silk and news from the wider world. Stevedores hauled cargo while watermen ferried passengers across the river in wherries, shouting obscenities at each other in a language unique to the Thames. The streets were narrow, deliberately so. Upper stories of timber-framed houses jutted out over the lanes, creating shaded tunnels where the sun never reached the cobblestones. Open drains called kennels ran down the centre of each street, carrying animal waste, kitchen slops, and the contents of chamber pots toward the river. The stench was overwhelming. Visitors from the countryside would press handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar to their noses. But London was also magnificent. The newly restored King Charles II held court at Whitehall Palace. The great Gothic bulk of St Paul's Cathedral dominated the skyline, though its steeple had been struck by lightning decades earlier. In Cheapside, goldsmiths displayed their wares in shop windows glazed with expensive glass. Booksellers clustered around St Paul's churchyard, selling everything from Bibles to seditious pamphlets. Coffee houses had begun to appear, filled with merchants arguing about ships and sugar prices. The population was stratified with brutal precision. Wealthy merchants lived in stone houses near the Royal Exchange. Artisans, weavers, tailors, shoemakers occupied the middle ranks, living above their workshops in the tangle of streets around Cripplegate and Aldersgate. Below them were the labourers, the street sellers, the coal heavers and water carriers, and below them the desperately poor, crammed into tenements in the Liberties where entire families shared single rooms. The city was connected by sound. Church bells marked the hours. Street criers announced goods for sale: fresh mackerel, hot pies, milk from the cow, the hammering of blacksmiths, the sawing of carpenters, the rumble of carts on stone. London was loud, crowded, filthy, and alive. Then the heat came, and the rats began to die. The plague did not announce itself with trumpets. It crept through the western Liberties in April and May, killing a few people here, a family there. The bills of mortality, weekly lists, of deaths compiled by parish clerks, showed small numbers at first. 9 deaths from plague in the first week of May, 14 in the second. The wealthy paid little attention. Plague was a disease of the poor, everyone knew. It struck the overcrowded tenements, the dark alleys, the places respectable people never visited. But the numbers kept rising. 28 deaths in early June, 43 the next week. Suddenly it was no longer confined to St Giles. The infection moved eastward, jumping from parish to parish like fire through dry timber. By the end of June, the bills recorded over 200 plague deaths. That was when the exodus began. King Charles II left London on July 27th, relocating his court to Hampton Court and eventually Oxford. He was followed by the aristocracy, who shuttered their townhouses and fled to country estates. Then came the merchants, the lawyers, the physicians. The College of Physicians, the city's most learned medical men, abandoned London almost to a man. Of the 79 licensed doctors practicing in the city, only 3 remained. For those with money, escape was possible. But a seat on a wagon leaving London cost 5 shillings, more than a labourer earned in a week. And even if you had the fare, the countryside was hostile. Villages posted armed men on their roads, turning back Londoners with threats of violence. You needed a certificate of health from your parish, and parishes stopped issuing them as the death toll mounted. The poor were trapped. They watched the rich flee and knew they had been abandoned. The law courts closed. Parliament adjourned to Oxford. The theatres shut their doors. The mechanisms of government, commerce and justice simply stopped functioning. What remained was a skeleton administration, the Lord Mayor, a handful of aldermen, and the parish officials tasked with enforcing the nightmare to come. By late July, London had become unrecognisable. Grass grew in the streets around Whitehall Palace. The Thames was nearly empty of boats. The Navy kept its ships away from the pestilential city. The constant roar of urban life had given way to an oppressive, melancholic silence, broken only by the tolling of bells. The authorities had enacted draconian plague orders based on a simple, brutal logic: isolate the sick to save the healthy. When plague struck a household, that household was sealed. Everyone inside, sick and healthy alike, was locked in for 40 days. A watchman was posted at the door day and night, armed with a halberd. He brought food and water, carried messages, and reported deaths. He also prevented escape. The psychological horror of this policy cannot be overstated. Families were imprisoned in hot, cramped tenements during the hottest summer in memory. They shared space with dying relatives, then with corpses that could not be removed until the dead cart made its rounds. The smell was unbearable. Rotting food, putrefying bodies, human waste. Windows were kept shut because people believed night air spread the plague. Some tried to escape. They drugged their watchmen with brandy or wine. They bribed them with whatever they had left of value. They hacked through the plaster and lath walls of their houses, fleeing through neighbours' yards under cover of darkness. Samuel Pepys, the naval administrator whose diary provides our most vivid account of the plague year, recorded the shrieks of women and children coming from locked houses, a sound so frequent it pierced the stoutest heart. The enforcement of quarantine relied on a grim hierarchy of parish officials. Searchers of the dead, usually poor, elderly women, were hired to examine corpses and determine the cause of death. They were notoriously unreliable. Many were illiterate. Most had no medical training. Families bribed them to record deaths as spotted fever or consumption instead of plague, desperate to avoid the 40-day lockdown. The searchers themselves often contracted the disease and died within days. The streets became a landscape of avoidance. People walked down the centre of lanes to avoid the walls where sick people might lean. They refused to shake hands. They stopped visiting each other entirely. The normal courtesies of urban life, greetings, conversations, the simple acknowledgement of another person's existence, disappeared. When 2 people met on the street, they would turn their faces away and hurry past. The sensory experience of the city had transformed. The dominant sound was bells, the constant monotonous tolling that announced each new burial. By August, there were so many dead that the bells rang day and night. Eventually, the authorities banned them, fearing they would spread panic. The dominant smell was smoke. Bonfires burned on street corners, fueled by pitch and sulphur, supposedly to cleanse the corrupted air. People carried nosegays of herbs, rosemary, rue, wormwood, pressed to their faces. Samuel Pepys bought rolled tobacco to chew, hoping it would ward off infection. At night, the dead carts came. They moved through the streets with torches, the drivers calling out, "Bring out your dead." Bodies were piled onto the carts, sometimes 40 or 50 in a single load, and hauled to the burial grounds beyond the walls. The great plague pits at Moorfields were 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, dug deep into the London clay. Bodies were stacked in layers covered with thin dustings of lime and soil. When one pit filled, another was dug beside it. By early September, the bills of mortality recorded over 7,000 deaths in a single week. Modern historians believe the true number was higher, perhaps 10,000. The parish clerks couldn't keep pace. People were dying faster than they could be counted, faster than they could be buried. In some parishes, the dead outnumbered the living. In the absence of medical authority, Londoners turned to anyone who offered hope. The streets were plastered with advertisements for miracle cures. Infallible preventive pills sold for sixpence. Sovereign cordials against the corruption of the air promised to protect entire families. Most were useless. Some were actively toxic. The medical marketplace was a grotesque carnival of desperation. Quack doctors hawked nostrums made from garlic, vinegar, and the flesh of vipers. Theriac, an ancient remedy, was so expensive only the wealthy could afford it. For the poor, there were cheaper options. Hellebore to induce sweating, vomiting, and purging. One mineral preparation was so potent it reportedly cured the disease by laying all those who took it quietly in the grave together. The most bizarre treatments relied on sympathetic magic. People wore amulets made from dried toad carcasses around their necks, or affixed them to their armpits, believing the toad would draw the poison from their bodies. Others held the warm bodies of chickens or pigeons against their buboes, thinking the heat would pull out the infection. Physicians who should have known better endorsed these practices because they had nothing else to offer. A few medical men stayed. William Boghurst, an apothecary in St Giles, treated 40 to 60 patients a day throughout the summer. He worked without rest, visiting locked houses, lancing buboes, prescribing his own remedies. In his treatise, Loimographia, he recorded his observations with brutal clarity. The plague began in little low poor houses, he wrote, but it did not discriminate. It killed rich and poor, moral and immoral, young and old. Boghurst himself survived, though he never explained how. Religious interpretation filled the void left by medical failure. In a world without germ theory, the plague could only be understood as divine judgment. Preachers thundered from pulpits that God was punishing London for its sins. The recent restoration of the monarchy, the moral laxity of the court, the theatres and alehouses and brothels, all had invited God's wrath. Solomon Eccles, a Quaker who had burned his musical instruments as sinful vanity, became the voice of apocalyptic doom. He walked the streets naked except for a loincloth, carrying a pan of burning coals and sulphur on his head, screaming, "Repent, repent." He appeared at the Eleanor Cross in Cheapside, ranting that a great fire would soon consume the city. To the terrified population of 1665, his prophecies felt like truth. The social fabric unravelled. Families abandoned dying relatives. Servants fled their employers. The bonds of community, already strained by fear and isolation, broke entirely. Pepys noted in his diary a strange psychological numbing. By August, he had come almost to think nothing of it when encountering corpses in the street. This hardening was necessary. To survive required a kind of emotional shutdown, a refusal to process the scale of loss. Yet small acts of solidarity persisted. Parish officials who could have fled stayed at their posts. Watchmen stood at their assigned doors despite the danger. Clergy visited the sick, offering last rites when no one else would enter the houses. The artisan John New, a weaver in Cripplegate, stayed with his dying children when he could have fled. He died 3 days after them, unable or unwilling to abandon his trade, his tools, his identity. September was the worst month. The heat persisted deep into autumn. The bills recorded death tolls that defied comprehension. 7,000 one week, 8,000 the next. In the parish of Stepney, 92% of recorded deaths were from plague. In St Giles, entire streets stood empty, their inhabitants dead or fled. The economic collapse was total. Trade with London ceased. Foreign nations quarantined English ships. Within the city, markets closed. Bakeries stopped baking. The trade in second-hand clothing, a vital part of the urban economy, was banned because cloth was believed to carry infection. Artisans who depended on daily wages found themselves without work or income. Parish records show that 84% of people in locked houses were chargeable, too poor to support themselves, entirely dependent on parish relief that barely existed. The cost of maintaining quarantine fell on those least able to bear it. Watchmen earned meagre wages, searchers worked for pennies, and often died within days of taking up their posts. The parish coffers emptied. The Bishop of London reported that many thousands of poor artisans were on the brink of starvation. Those locked in their houses faced a choice between slow death from plague or slow death from hunger. Children suffered most. Families locked in tenements watched their children sicken, knowing they could not call for help. If a child developed the telltale bubo, there was nothing to be done. The best a parent could hope for was that the swelling would suppurate and break, releasing the infection. More often, the appearance of tokens, dark spots caused by internal bleeding, signaled the end. Children died in their parents' arms, and parents died surrounded by their children's bodies. By late September, the bills began to show a decline. 8,000 deaths, then 7,000, then 6,000. It was not mercy that ended the plague. It was autumn. Cooler weather killed the fleas that transmitted the disease. The surviving population had developed some immunity. The plague burned through the most vulnerable and ran out of easily accessible victims. But London was fundamentally changed. Entire streets were depopulated. Trades disappeared because all the practitioners were dead. Families were erased. Names that had existed for generations simply ended. The psychic wound was profound and permanent. By November, the king returned to London. Life began, tentatively, to resume. Shops reopened, markets reappeared. But the city that emerged from the plague was not the city that had entered it. The official death toll from the parish clerks was 68,596. Modern demographic analysis suggests the true number exceeded 100,000, nearly 20% of London's population. Entire parishes had been decimated. The liberties, where the plague hit hardest, would take decades to recover. The survivors faced a transformed economic landscape. The massive labour shortage gave power to those who remained. Wages rose. Lords desperate to have land worked offered better terms. The rigid hierarchies that had defined pre-plague London began to crack. For the first time in centuries, ordinary labourers had leverage. But before recovery could truly begin, another catastrophe struck. On September 2nd, 1666, a fire began in a bakery on Pudding Lane. Fanned by strong easterly winds, it spread through the tinderbox of timber houses and warehouses filled with flammable goods. The Lord Mayor, Thomas Bloodworth, dismissed it at first, saying a woman could piss it out. By the time he recognised the danger, it was too late. The fire burned for 5 days, destroying 13,000 houses and 87 churches. The myth persists that the Great Fire ended the plague by burning down the dirty houses and killing the rats. Modern evidence refutes this. The plague was already subsiding before the fire began. The worst affected parishes, Whitechapel, Southwark, Clerkenwell, remained unburned. The fire consumed only about a quarter of urban London. The decline of the plague came from natural causes: cold weather, population immunity, and perhaps a shift in the rat population itself. What the fire did accomplish was force a radical reconstruction. Parliament passed the Rebuilding Acts of 1667 and 1670, mandating permanent changes to London's structure. All new buildings had to be brick or stone. Thatch roofs were banned. The practice of building upper stories that jutted over streets, those dark medieval tunnels, was abolished. Streets were widened to allow air circulation and prevent fire spread. These changes, driven by fire safety rather than public health, had an unintended consequence. Brick foundations and walls provided fewer nesting sites for rats. The reduction in overcrowding meant disease spread less easily. While the miasma theory was scientifically wrong, the physical transformation of London created a city where plague could no longer gain the foothold it had in 1665. The psychological scars ran deeper than the physical ones. Londoners who survived carried the memory of locked houses, tolling bells, and streets of the dead. Art became obsessed with mortality. The great diarist Samuel Pepys, who had prospered during the plague year through clever bureaucratic manoeuvring, never forgot the carts rumbling past his window at night. The Great Plague of 1665 remains the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in Britain. London,